Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Fireside Chat. We're really excited to have you with us. Just while we're getting started, if you can pop your name and where you're from into the chat area, that is great. There'll be a Q&A chat opened as well if you want to throw in any questions in there, and we'll try to get to them. And if you're watching as a recording, then please send any email with any questions you've got after, and we will try and get to them then. So again, welcome. Welcome to the great panel of thinkers. We will get to your introductions in a bit, but just to introduce this subject a little bit, it's one really close to my heart personally, but also in terms of the work that we're doing at Climate Exchange. So it's a conversation really sitting at the intersection of climate, communication, and culture. A space that we've been looking at how we can drive the relevancy of a climate narrative. And that's why we've got this diverse group of thinkers and experts together in areas of culture, product, and generally what it's like to be human and how we react to subjects like this. And then why culture as a lens for climate is something that we often get asked about. And it's really about that when we talk about climate, we often talk about the science first, the statistics first, and the policies first, which we obviously need to create certain types of change. But also, what about the stories that really make that framing relatable? Like, well, how do we create relevancy to people in their day-to-day life? Really get to grips with why people should care. Of course, on a greater level, we should care because we should care about the planet, but there is life that potentially gets into the way of how we take action and how we interact with these subjects. And then what about the symbols we use, the rituals, the products, and the ideas that shape the way that people live and help that adaptation into a world that we're moving in, whether we like it or not. I think perhaps mitigation is slightly a little bit late, and now it's about how we have to adapt to this brave new world that we're going to step into. And so that's the territory we're going to step into today and explore. Because this isn't just a scientific or political issue, and it's a cultural issue. The questions that we're going to be looking at today are really about those that influence perception, look at building action, and triggering imagination. So really, like, what is climate and what is climate culture, and who gets to shape that conversation? How can we create ideas and stories and products and services around climate that people actually want to be a part of? And specifically for journalists, how can we create or use that engagement to inform and to mobilize? And then the last question we'll look at is, in a world where sort of a scientific literacy isn't a guarantee, how can we build that gap without dumbing things down or compromising the integrity of what we're producing, whether it be stories, products, and services as communications experts. So to explore these questions, I'm super honoured to have the three panelists with us today. Excuse me. We've got Adrian Barrow, a strategist working at the cutting edge of brand culture, helping organisations find their voice, their values, especially in this time of volatility and change. And he will introduce himself in a much more thorough way, but welcome and thank you. We've got Ruth Wassermann, a design and product strategist, bringing her unique lens to how things are made and consumed and experienced, and how we can build that, the role of those products and services in a more climate resilient future. And then we've got Suzanne Dhaliwal, who's an artist, writer, and cultural strategist, looking at bringing together environmental justice, Indigenous solidarity, and creative activism in super powerful ways. So thank you for being here. And without further ado, I'm just going to jump into everyone introducing themselves. So if you could just say who you are, and maybe the first question to pose to you all is what culture means in the industries where you work and the sectors that you work, and how does it influence the way you engage with climate and the climate narrative at large? And I think maybe we'll start with you, Adrian. Good morning.
Wow. Okay. Good morning, everyone, or whatever time zone you're replaying this in. My name is Adrian Barrow. I have worked as a brand and communication strategist for the last 30 years, principally, I would say, in large advertising agencies, digital marketing agencies, I've had the benefit of working in a multitude of different companies, such as the nature, the vagaries of a life and career in advertising. I've also had the opportunity, the privilege of working across 4 continents over my career. I began in Australia and then have worked in Asia and Europe and America. And I'm currently coming to you from London, where I'm doing a few projects. Why is a kind of a marketer, why is a brand and communication strategist talking to you today about journalism and about climate and the intersection of those things? Well, my explanation, and hopefully I can prove the relevance of this, is that I spent most of my career helping my clients to win in marketplaces. And most of the time, the framework, particularly from a marketing and advertising point of view, is helping clients' brands win in marketplaces of products. But as a strategist, it became quite clear to me early on in my career that to be a successful brand, to have successful sales, to be desired and aspired to as a brand, you also need to win in a marketplace of ideas. And culture, for me, is a marketplace of ideas. And so what does that mean for the work that you do as journalists? Well, at a top level, I think that we have to help your readers, help more generally the citizens and the public of the world kind of understand climate, not just simply as Shireen was saying, as a set of scientific facts, information, but also to see it as perhaps an aspiration, something that kind of feels as though we are, as a sort of a planetary population, aspiring to a different way of life, a better way of life. And I'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail. That's in effect an idea. An aspiration is an idea. And I think that, I don't know if the jury's still out, but certainly it kind of feels as though people are suffering from awareness fatigue. They're suffering from a lack of trust, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today. And in the same way, products and services that are sold in a marketplace of products, those brands find it difficult to establish trust. And once they do, it's very perilous when they lose that. And so hopefully we can dig into that in a lot more detail and talk about what it means to win in a marketplace of ideas, and to help people see climate and climate change as a very personal ambition, as a personal aspiration, rather than just a distant, murky aspiration that people themselves don't have to worry too much about.
Yeah, I think those points are the critical bit about building value in the climate narrative is really essential. I think borrowing from the aspirational design of that and how actually it's cool and awesome and wonderful to be living in a way that is around that. And I think the other thing that we will definitely touch on is the level of journalistic trust within that and how we can build on that. So thanks for that intro. Suzanne, should we go over to you next?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, I'm Suzanne Dhaliwal, and I actually started this work in a different place than I've ended up, which is true of many of us in this work. So I actually started working with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, with Indigenous communities who, as we know, and as we'll hear about more as we go on this road to COP30 in Brazil, with Indigenous peoples, they are on the front lines of extractivism of the fossil fuels that we need to keep in the ground. So my work there was really about understanding about the impacts of extractivism on Indigenous communities. So at that point, I didn't even have the lens of climate change. I was looking at this as a lens through the lens of culture side, ecocide, genocide. And so that work is really about telling a longer story that's been going on for 400 years and to rehumanize Indigenous communities in multiple senses. One, even that they exist. You'd be surprised how many people don't understand that Indigenous people, especially in Canada, where I was working, exist on their lands and what they've been going through, from a systemic slow industrial genocide to fighting for and protecting and the stewardship of their lands. So there's a dual sort of action happening there, both the impacts on those communities, the cultures at stake, but also the deep solutions and traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge that is there to move us into the climate future. So I think that's why my lens comes from a dual place of both thinking about advocating for the impacts of climate change already, fitting it into this 400-year story of settler colonialism, extractivism, but then also decolonizing the knowledge space in a sense, because it's, you know, even those indigenous cultures, you know, have come from time immemorial, as some communities would say. They hold the synergies of where science and technology, where an art and culture needs to go into the future. So that decolonization process is at the heart of the cultural work. And then specifically some of that work around the tar sands in Canada, and I worked with communities impacted by Shell in Nigeria, and the connecting thread between all these communities is about that humanization. And we're seeing that now in its most violent, extreme form in Gaza, in Palestine, that continual story of what does it look like when we dehumanize indigenous peoples to the point where we are numb, incapacitated to respond to the stories. And I think that's something we'll talk about here. You know, in climate communication, we think, oh, if we show the worst wildfires, if we show these things, people will act. And we're really in a moment where we need to stock take, actually, do we act? What does it take to activate empathy? And then the other point of that is this, again, this dual action of what we need to communicate the story at large, that témoignage, that witnessing, and then also the communication services and the functions that we need in this climate changed world. You know, there's wildfires raging in Manitoba, unprecedented that we've ever seen. There's need for mutual aid, for airlifting people, and those are different kinds of climate products and services that we need. So I think that's kind of the smorgasbord of ways that we're thinking about these cultural shifts. And some of that work has also looked at challenging the cultural institutions themselves that uphold these relationships with corporations such as BP and Shell. So I think there's so many rich ways that culture touches on this work, and also rooms for possibilities and innovations. I'll hold there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think it's really important that also this opens up another subject which we'll perhaps jump into, which is I think you said that we've got an activate empathy, and I think it's a really interesting role of journalism in terms of, you know, where do we sit in that, and where does the integrity lie, and how do we build on that, and how do we honor the stories that are coming from different parts of the world, and actually highlighting them as really positive, and the innovations are actually really progressive, and sometimes the innovations are more progressive than in the global north. So I think it's a really interesting way of how we can actually start to readdress that balance. And we're working with some journalists in Africa, and they're uncovering really great cultural stories that actually are driving the journalists to be part of some of the innovation and solutions. And so that social innovation is being driven by those. So I think that whole circular thing is a really interesting way of how that conversation can carry on from story through to product, through to sharing that knowledge around the world. So thank you for that. We'll dig into a bit more. And hello, Ruth. Welcome.
Hi there. Hi. Thanks for that. That was really interesting to hear about the different ways that you both come at the idea of what culture means and how it affects climate. And I'm interested because, Suzanne, the work you do is almost the absolute opposite side of the coin of some of the work that I've been involved in, which is about that kind of global supply chain and you know, the things that you're talking about in the way that it affects local communities, has led me to be working in the way that I am now. So I am a product and design leader. I've worked in-house for 20 years, leading in brands and in retail, mainly in the home and hospitality space. in particular with brands like Made.com, Mooprint, and Urkel Furniture. So I've had the full spectrum of retailer, brand, e-com, and manufacturing. I did that for about 20 years, and I now work independently with clients on a project and fractional basis. So I support strategy and design, but now through a lens of sustainable innovation. And I think, yeah, it's some of those things you touched on, Suzanne, that kind of led me to a growing unease around, you know, the constant creation of things, which is a necessity if you're involved with creating physical products. And you know what culture means in the spaces that I work in. So that's around home hospitality, but also around the culture of commerce and the culture of design and style. So, you know, it's heavily driven by consumer sentiment. One of my colleagues talks about the expectation economy. So everything that goes on in modern culture and commerce impacts how people are engaging with the things that they buy and use in their home space. In particular, the culture of our homes has shifted quite significantly with the pandemic. So, you know, we've been spending so much more time at home. We're working from home now, and it really shifted the way that people have started to think and feel about their home. And it's been quite linked to a sense of nurturing, and it's also then engaged with thoughts about how it connects to the environment. And that's quite similar with travel and hospitality. So more in the hospitality spaces, I would say, than in how people are choosing to travel, because I don't think that people are particularly climate aware when they choose how to travel. But actually, there's been a real blurring between work and leisure spaces in hospitality, and that's changed the way that the kind of culture happens in those spaces. And then the other thing is about how people feel about buying. So I guess, you know, we are starting to see more things like peer-to-peer used products like Vinterior, which enables people to think more thriftily and differently about the way that they're buying and owning things. There's a culture now around non-ownership, so that might be peer-to-peer borrowing, hire, or buying secondhand. And that kind of links to how we reconcile the idea of fast fashion with what I think is a growing awareness of the impacts that the products that we use and buy are having on the environment. So I think, you know, that's how I view the role of culture in my industry. And, you know, thinking about how it affects how I engage. I'm passionate about sustainability. And as I said, there is a real tension between buying new things and knowing that we need to buy less things and we need to consume less. And I think that's why I am trying now to engage with sustainable innovation within the space that I work in, thinking about circular economies, thinking about how we can create regenerative systems, thinking about innovating in the way that we buy, source, move products. So there's a lot of movement around nearshore sourcing, for example, whether we might be able to redistribute where we're buying things from. Possibly Trump's protectionist policies might have a kind of unintended positive consequence for the environment in that sense. But I think the other thing is that what I do, because it's about design, it's about your personal spaces and choices people make, it is really about how people think, feel, and behave, and that consumer sentiment. And I think then when you think about the world of journalism and how what I do connects with that, it's actually just tapping into how people are feeling, how you can impact behavior in the way that you're communicating all of this stuff in various ways to impact how people behave and how people feel.
Yeah, I was just literally jotting down notes because I was getting really excited about the work around potential design of products and services by and for journalists. So we work quite a lot in what does that look like? You know, what does a climate news product from a newsroom look like, and what does the journalist service start to develop within the climate space? And I think how you've taken some of those things and then connected it about I think you said think, feel, behave, and then consume in terms of building that value story are really critical from terms of transferable things that we should look at as journalists in how we're developing it. And then the flip side to that is then how we talk about the narratives within our stories within that. You know, how does the innovation angle come through, and how do we as journalists highlight that in a way that then links through to what Suzanne was saying about sort of this driving empathy and understanding, but also then to Adrian's point, what's the need of the product? Like, so I think it's a really I think it's all of these things for me link really beautifully in terms of how journalists can learn from this industry and this space. And just to build on that, just to go on to the next sort of area is really taking these thoughts and saying, how can we build this relevancy and trust? And how can journalists do that with the knowledge that you have? I think if we sort of move into that space, that would be amazing. Suzanne, do you want to tackle that question first?
Do you want to just reiterate again? Because there was so much content there.
Yeah, sure. How what we do and the subjects that we just touched on, and how culture can shape how journalism uses culture to build relevancy and build trust in their space.
Perfect. I think there's two sort of moments there, and I think one, again, in terms of the longer story that we're telling here, and when I started work on the Canadian tar sands, it was actually the stories that we were getting in London about Indigenous communities coming to the UK, about that relationship with the treaties, people understanding the cultural heritage of Indigenous communities, that activated a whole generation, I would say, in the 2010s around environmental justice and climate justice. And the press played a pivotal role in that in terms of the investigative journalism. And I think that was critical, and working in synergy with different NGOs, different scientific advisors, doctors, to get that longer story out there about how the fossil fuel industry was involved in lobbying, undermining EU climate policy as well. So that role is critical to keep that beat going. And then the other part of it was the real, again, I mentioned that humanization, about talking about the cultural heritage that is at stake. And if we know what is being lost, then we can understand what we're fighting for as well. And I think that's where some of the the longer Guardian video journalism that we had there, or photo essays, and some of the documentary as well. And I think we're in a moment where those documentaries need to be shorter. They need, because of the attention economy, but they're still really critical. And I think you mentioned that point of not skipping over, but becoming clever in how we tell those longer range stories as well. And then the other part of that, I think, is, we're moving now from a sort of attention economy to an interest economy. So that means, the way the algorithm is feeding us content, it's actually based on our interests. So those entry points into the climate conversation, like Ruth, you mentioned travel. I just worked on a short series with Earthrise Studio about how is travel being impacted by climate change? How is, pilgrimage and Hajj, those parts of our life that are essential already being impacted by climate change. So doing that, connecting the dots work of reaching people where they are, reaching where it's in their lives as well, is really critical. And I think, we don't have to lose the substance. It's not necessarily dumbing down. And I think that's the other thing in terms of reckoning the moment we're in. Like, most people, unless they've been gleefully under a rock, know about the climate crisis. And those people who have been turned or are aware kind of are with us. Those who will continue to be climate deniers are kind of in that space. So we're really in a space where it's about the people that we've got, deepening their understanding, deepening their ways of understanding the impact that they can have, and bringing the history as well of what's already happened. We often think in a generation we're reinventing this. But who are the elders like Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Ogoni people, the Indigenous peoples who have been doing this work for a while, for us to understand, actually, this is not that new. It's not radical. So, moving the radar a little bit, that protecting life, protecting water, these things are not radical in its sense. So I think, really focusing on, even my attention span is quite short. So short form documentary work. And I think also who's getting the resources to do that work and building up capacity. I think that would be another thing. And as we see this generation, I think 70% of UK youth don't want to be online anymore. So in order to keep youth online who have been, past 2 years, have been traumatized online, we're going to have to really think about the content that engages, that brings people together, and also online, offline functionality. So and I think gaming offers us some interesting spaces for there. If we think about Pokemon phenomena, the game itself brought youth together as well. So I think we can have a lot to learn from the gaming space, the way social media influencers are changing to the attention economy. And also as we see more resources coming out from conventional media, what's the role of new media and building up platforms to have higher quality digital content as well to fill that gap. So that's some of the spaces. And the last thing I would say would also be, with journalists as well, with the cultural outputs that come out from climate change, using those as a moment, as a hook. Like there's a great, Netflix content, documentary. So how can those documentaries and those moments be a chance to go deeper into those elements, those storytelling as well, and also telling us what they need. Like, what do you need as well? What's missing? What would get you engaged with a climate sculpture? What are the gaps there as well? So more dialogue, more communication, so we understand what's happening in your context. And then the last thing, and I think this is a question for the industry at large, is, how will we mitigate the impacts of fascism and the trust that we need to build within journalism, so that we can trust as well that, we are adhering to human rights, we are adhering to supporting that. And I think Belém, the road to COP this year, is going to be a really, really fascinating moment for us to see how we report on that, how we continue to balance Indigenous knowledge alongside the process as well. So yeah, lots there. I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, so much. I'm like, well, just a question which I'm going to throw back to you is the one around how will we drive trust? Do you have any sort of initial thoughts on that, on the driving of trust in these spaces? I think the interest economy in terms of leveraging that, and YouTube has highlighted that as an area of saying actually young kids are really interested in news and climate space. It's just how we turn up, which is the issue. And actually, really leveraging what they're interested in, as opposed to just assuming it's like, oh no, it's not a space that, climate and journalism are not a space they're interested in. It's that actually it's not true. It's actually just how we're turning up. So yeah, is there a space
I think more, we've kind of, like, in the 2010s, there was a lot more focus on frontline communities and environmental justice voices. And we've gone through this moment of influencers, and it's a moment, and we're there. And now we need to think about how do we build up the dialogue between the influencers and those on the front lines, normal people, everyday voices. So what's the capacity that needs to be built, like, say with the youth who lives in front of a refinery, who, what are the capacities that we can build for more voices that are coming from that? And also more channels, more spaces to build where those communities can communicate. And I think one critical thing is that it's not always about communicating to the mainstream audience as well. Sometimes some of the best communication comes out more like how radio works. Radio is trying to communicate to the community. It's trying to share stories within the community, share information. So thinking like a radio station and bringing that thinking to social media could be really interesting. Like, what does it look like for youth to share intergenerational knowledge? So building up more ecosystems as well. And then the other thing goes back to funding as well. And we know that funding dictates where the stories come from. So at that point as well, like, how do we be cultural shifters? How do we go for the unusual story? When we were talking about tar sands and these things, in 2010, it was innovative, it was edgy. So being a leader, telling the untold stories, going into the spaces that are a bit sticky. And I think that's a real, being brave. What we're facing is unprecedented. So that bravery, and that's where those stories will come from, and know that people are hungry for a sort of realism, in those stories as well.
Amazing, thank you. I'm just going to bounce over to Adrian, because a lot of what Suzanne was reflecting, sort of this dialogue and this marketplace of ideas that you referenced to before. So perhaps you could build on that a little bit around the cultural shaping and journalists' role in that, especially around the trust and relevancy angles.
Yeah. Let me come at this from a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to bet that the majority of the audience of professional journalists who are tuning into this very definitely see their role, particularly professionally, perhaps even personally, as being reporting on what's happening, right? Traditional journalism is about imparting information to people so that they can make their own judgments, they can be more informed, and hopefully decide with that information, what they're going to do in their life. I think there's a next level out, and I'm sure this won't be particularly surprising to the journalists who are tuning in. Engagement. So from information, we might describe the evolving role of journalism to be engagement, right? Not just what's happening in the world, but here's why it matters to you, which is kind of solutions journalism. And I think in this climate space, there's a long history here of moving from just facts to solutions. What is it that we can do with those facts to improve either things at a planetary level or things at a communal level or an individual level? I think there's something actually beyond that as well. And this draws on a lot of my experience sort of as a brand and communication strategy, which is agency, right? And we might frame this as, here's how climate is changing and how you can help care for the planet better. But as I think about the difference between information engagement and agency, it's about moving from kind of solutions and facts-based journalism to kind of what I call cultural architecture. And I think that causes us to ask and answer the question for ourselves as journalists: what if we stopped seeing ourselves basically as outside observers and started recognizing our role as kind of cultural pattern makers, helping people see patterns in culture, which after all is the soup that people swim around in every day, that helps shape their identity, helps shape their aspirations, as I said before. And I think all of that's crucial to the development of products, right? The development of new journalistic products. If those journalistic products need to move from informing people to engaging people to empowering people, then trust is a non-negotiable thing, right? We can't move from information to agency or empowerment unless there is trust. We know that from history and politics. We know that from history and commerce and the brand world. But here's the issue: when you spend a lot of time, like I have, in kind of market research environments, whether it be quant or qual or increasingly kind of AI-driven research, with consumers of that information, with consumers of those solutions, with products that attempt to empower and give people agency, you realize, or I have realized, that those readers, those recipients of that information are filtering your message. And they're filtering it through a range of different kind of filters. One is a sort of a well-understood thing in psychology, which is kind of motivated reasoning, which leads people to make different conclusions with the same data. And we see that all the time in kind of climate journalism. The facts are interpreted by people in different ways, and they lead to different conclusions, different outcomes. The other, I think, Shireen mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is around authority structures, right? Who gets to be a trusted messenger? And that can vary pretty dramatically across cultural context. So if I was helping a client, maybe a journalism client, maybe a newsroom, to build a product, I would want to ask the question, in what way can we design this product and engineer this product to be a trusted messenger? The third thing, and it's a thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I don't know that it's all that well understood, is this idea of schema formation. So if you just take a simple kind of provocation, like when you hear polar bear on melting ice, different people's brains process that phrase, polar bear melting on ice, very differently. And they run it through different schemas in their head, right? So on the one hand, you have this kind of environmental sort of crisis schema. And when you hear polar bear melting on ice, for some people who have this environmental crisis schema, that screams, triggers, urgency, guilt, a sense of being overwhelmed. And actually, that's not helpful if what we want to try and do is create a product that builds trust. Triggering feelings of urgency, guilt, and feeling overwhelmed is not going to result in us necessarily bridging the gap from untrusted to trusted as journalists. The other schema that gets in the way of products establishing trust is this kind of distant problem schema, right? So there's some people who receive information from journalists about climate change, and they kind of file it away as something that's happening somewhere else, hence the idea of distant problem. Obviously, I think as Suzanne has mentioned already, there's a sort of a political issue schema, which is like, does this piece of information through this product raise skepticism about the messages or the messenger's authenticity? And so it's not helpful. It's kind of non-helpful for our new product to raise unnecessarily skepticism about the messages or the messenger's authenticity. And so the fact here is around the same factual information through a new product gets interpreted completely differently depending on which kind of cognitive filtering is going on. And we have to anticipate that there are a multitude of different schemas. There's a multitude of different cognitive filters that are going on. And in order to build a product that doesn't trigger distrust, or a product that instills and engenders trust, so we can move along that journey from information all the way to agency and empowerment, we need to anticipate what they are, and we need to build products and services and design them so that we can kind of step over, around, or through those issues, because that's what human beings do with facts.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you were talking about this sort of like filtering process, because we just got a piece of research back from our project Mar, which looks at over 7 million articles over the last 40 years. And a lot of it becomes framing of it and how we've actually framed the language of climate. And so that's obviously changed a lot over time, because climate change didn't exist multiple years ago. And it was, sort of our first interaction with how we were introduced to this subject alters that process of how we filter things out, right? And how we become either immune or disengaged or fearful, or any of those triggers that come along with it. And are we, we're even trying to work out of the people that were exposed to a lot of this sort of the thing around ozone layer. And, are we desensitized because nothing ever happened? Our skin wasn't burnt off, right? Like now, what we don't talk about, actually, we did put a load of solutions against that. And we worked as a global unit to try and solve for a lot of that. And there was a lot of linking of arms, but that sort of filtering is really, really interesting in this space. Especially we've seen even divides around north and south, in terms of global north and global south, in terms of politicization of the climate message, and interest level in politics and not, and also dissatisfaction with life and satisfaction with life factors. So there's a load that goes into this. And then there's also, I think, the thing about the visuals and the words and the visuals, like you said, the polar bear on ice. It's like it makes people go, oh, it's the distant thing. Oh, I don't have a glacier near me. Like it's a poor polar bear. But it's a really interesting factor. Have you got any sort of example about sort of a product that's moved through this space?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I have a product. I have an idea of a product or a case study of a product that is actually in the climate change space. And I'm not sure if your viewers or listeners or readers will know this, but France Television, I won't try and pronounce it as the French do, because I'm Australian and we just there. France Television created a journalistic product which is to embed climate information in the weather report. And so over time, when people tuned into the weather report for a news broadcast, they not only received information about what the weather would be like tomorrow or the next day, they received ongoing information about how the climate was changing based on kind of key metrics. And I think that's a genius idea, because if you're going to try not to trigger either a sense of like feeling overwhelmed or a sense of distrust or a sense that this is a politicized. You might embed the product as a subproduct within a broader product, which is the weather report, the weather forecast. And no one tunes into the weather report with their heckles up thinking, can I trust the forecast? Can I trust the weatherman or the weather person? There is the broad kind of acceptance that the information that's being transmitted through that journalistic product is trustworthy, is helpful. And so embedding kind of a piece of climate change journalism or a climate reality product in the context of something that's already trusted, for me, is a really good example of like what we should be striving for. And that's not necessarily an idea because it's already been done, but I think it's a design principle for how we should think about product and service design in journalistic world.
And it's also, I mean, borrows from brand worlds all the time, right? So it's like a contextual media placement, but actually it's around journalistic facts and an understanding of really what's happening in the larger space around that subject of weather. So yeah, I think, okay, everyone, we go away and we do that now in the journalistic community. Thank you, Adrian. Ruth, over to you.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, and I guess there's a few things that I could relate from my own world into how you might build that into products for journalism. But first off, I'm very interested. Adrian obviously didn't grow up in the era of Michael Fish in the UK, because I wouldn't have said that the weather report is always the most trustworthy on a temperate island. But I think on a serious note, though, I think what is actually interesting, and I think in some ways what's at the heart of that idea of what creates trust and what doesn't, is actually, if, sometimes words sound like opinions, but more often data sounds more factual or comes off as more factual. And I think that that's maybe what we're touching on when you think about the way that those things interact as a product. And I had a few thoughts about the ways that you can create information products that are, and it relates a little to what Suzanne was saying as well, because you talked about the world of gaming, and it's thinking about how people engage and how people trust. And I think that there's a few different modalities that you can go into there. But I might come back to that and just start from the top in the sense of the ways that I think about product creation in my world and how it relates, and particularly though how we think about shifting people's values and shifting norms around sustainability, because I think there's a few ways that you can drive behavior change, and I think that it's very relevant to the way that journalists might communicate, write about, talk about climate in ways that actually will impact and change behavior. So for me, there's three ways of looking at it. There's the standard pull and the push, and somewhere in the middle, there's a nudge. So I think, at a push situation, you've got a scenario where you have legislation that makes buying sustainable the best or only option. And in my world, that's happened in various ways. So we've got things like the EU timber regulations, which means that any wood felled in the UK or imported in the UK has to be done in a certain way. And, in some ways, when that was brought in, I was absolutely rejoicing, because just at a very personal industry level, to have legislation that means everybody's going to have to ask for the same thing is brilliant. And what's better about it is it doesn't just impact things that are happening in the EU, but when you change legislation around how things are brought into the EU or Britain or your region, where there's a global trade scenario, then it impacts how that thing is being done globally anywhere that products is being made and brought into a location. So in some ways, that's the benefit of globalization, because legislation changed in a powerful economic area will kind of change behavior globally. From a pull or from a nudge perspective, I think this is in one of the ways that journalism can probably be very effective. So shifting values around consumption, things like, in my world, making take-back schemes as easy as possible or incentivizing it. So, for example, the way that people now expect that they can trade in their old mobile phone to get money off a new one. You know, that is trading in old stuff where previously they just might not have thought that hard about the fact that they could sell it. And creating that same kind of economic sense around other products can really help to incentivize and normalize things like swapping back old things and the idea that things can be put back into use. I think, you know, creating optimism around sustainability is a way to create a nudge scenario, and using language. So when we're thinking about the way that you talk about sustainability, using language that implies a normalized behavior in a certain direction rather than another is a way that you say everybody's doing this, and it makes it normal, and it assumes that everybody should be doing a certain thing. So I think that's super interesting. And then from a pool perspective, you've got the idea basically of creating value in sustainability. So from a brand's perspective and from a brand product perspective, you're basically creating a new luxury by saying these amazing brands and products are sustainable. That's part of their core value. And they're absolutely aspirational and people really want them. So that's the kind of pool where you're basically making people absolutely want sustainable brands. And I guess I would use them in my business and think about how we can use all three of those things to begin to create a scenario where the ecosystem shifts towards more sustainable consumption through systems and products and services. So that's how it works with this. But coming back to the idea of then how you create products for journalism, I think you know, one of the things that's happening in my world as well is about the idea of on-demand creation. So we don't want to be creating loads of stock that's then going to sit in a warehouse and have to be disposed of. We want to be able to create a situation where consumers can order exactly what they want, so it's really wanted, and they can participate in the creation of it, and it's created only for them when they want it. And I think that in some ways that's a model that can work for journalism. So you might ask yourself the question, how can we not just create on-demand fixed content, but how can we create it in a way that's co-created? And, you know, Suzanne, your idea of radio is super interesting, because what is interesting about radio is, you know, the traditional radio phone-in is like totally co-creation, isn't it? It's like that kind of engaging with people and creating a dialogue. So that's one of the things I think is super interesting. The other thing then is about connecting that idea of gamification with the idea of data. And I think there's loads of amazing platforms. So I was looking recently at climatetrace.org, for example, and they've got these amazing visualizations of lots of the data around climate, and it shifts on a monthly basis. And I think it's super interesting to be able to kind of get in there, engage, and you're actively participating in finding out the information that's data driven and it's in a gamified way. And I think creating products that invite that kind of engagement where people get sucked in, not because they keep watching 20-second reels, but because they're actively engaging and they want to kind of go down a rabbit hole of more information. And I think that's where you create kind of trustworthiness. So I guess that's kind of, it's thinking about how we can translate some of the ideas, say from my world, into digital products or into products that really engage. And then the other example that I really loved, I'm not sure how effective it's been, but I think it's super great in embodying trust, is the idea of creating services that are very meaningful. So for example, The Guardian in the UK, their secure drop whistleblower platform, which has you know, enabled something which has been a problem to be securely facilitated. So I think those kind of meaningful platforms as well that can create a sense of trust as well are super helpful. But I think innovation, you know, it's thinking about innovation, it's thinking about how you can borrow from other worlds to replicate the kind of engagement, the kind of culture, the kind of aspiration and sense of luxury that you get from one place, and pull it into the world of journalism and products and how that can look.
Yeah, I think what's it's interesting you said this subject around, I'll just go back to the behavior change bit because it's come up quite a lot in here. And I know that for from the point of integrity in journalism, there's a question around this, right? So about, what is our actual, are we really here to do that? Or are we here to lay the facts out and then let people decide? But I think what you said about elevating that behavior change is around driving the integrity of journalism to elevate it to its engagement and trust is quite an interesting thought, because it also not only sets the tone for what products and services, whether that be digital, story, hybrid, whatever it is, it actually sets a different type of playing field, right? Because it's like, okay, we need to run everything we do through that lens of, does it rebuild the trust in journalism? And does it enable people to be engaged in creating solutions around climate? And when you put that lens over it, actually does contextually reframe quite a lot of potentially what we could be creating as journalists. Suzanne, I just want to pop that sort of idea over to you and see what you feel about that.
Yeah, and I think in order to do that, we have to be really real about the moment that we're in.
Yeah.
And that we've just had 600 days of live streamed genocide. And now we're seeing the tide turn, and we're seeing shift in the messaging. But we're in a generation where we have to really understand the paradigm shift, and the whole of climate change is a massive paradigm shift. But we've had that moment now where, how science has had that reckoning that it's subjective and objectivity does not exist. We're in a generation now that we understand the complicity, the active complicity with that genocide, what that will look like legally once we start to get accountability for what's happened, means that the landscape of media itself will change. So what new paradigm will we be in? So I think that's a question for history, posterity. But it means in this moment to really understand that we've lost objectivity, we've lost complete trust. We don't put on the BBC anymore and think it's unadulterated. We know all the forces of that. So in order to meet the moment, to actually become an agent of never mind change, just trust again, it's going to take paramount resources, and it might not even be recoupled in time. So I think without having that honest conversation about the illegality of what we've seen, it's going to take time for us to understand that. So it'd be interesting to know what are the internal conversations that are happening about, what's happened, what are the shifts that have happened, and then reflecting that on COP. And I think this first COP will be that moment to see, will we see a changed landscape in that? How are journalists themselves responding to that? Are they switching to becoming freelancers? Are they creating new portals, new spaces? Where are the whistleblowers inside those journalistic spaces as well? So I don't necessarily have the answers for that, but I think it's really critical that we understand how devastating that moment is. And especially the younger generation, I think for them, they won't necessarily be going on the news anymore. It will be TikTok, it will be Instagram. So also being prepared to fill that gap. And who's going to take that gap? It's going to be the far right. So there needs to be a real quick turnover in terms of accountability, in terms of, expressing where is the legality in journalism? How does the journalistic institutions themselves respond to that? Or will we see a completely new landscape of journalism emerge in this as well? So I think for me, it is a paradigm shift. But this also could bring possibilities for new trusted sources as well, and also accountability.
Yeah, and Adrian, just want to pick that up in terms of like possibility and opening that space up, because obviously COP is coming up, and we are we're trying to approach it in a slightly different way of saying, potentially a few journalists will go, but then 3 months after that, working out what news products and services could come and be actioned out of COP, as opposed to the other way around, which is we're going to report on COP, we're going to turn up, we're going to complain about that nothing happened, and then you know, wait for policy to come. So sort of, I suppose my question for you is, what could we leverage from COP in approaching it in a different way in terms of developing journalistic sort of the brand of journalism in a way, and how that could be used to inform what journalists do with it?
Yeah. So I'm going to reference a project that I did last year for a global energy services company. I won't name them, but they service very large businesses, very large organizations, government, along with tens and tens of thousands of small to medium-sized enterprises with those organizations' energy needs. They do a little bit of generation, they do a little bit of transmission, but basically they're selling energy that is generated and transmitted through infrastructure. So, you know, whether it be nuclear, whether it be renewable, whether it be fossil fuel generated energy. And the project that I'm thinking about was effectively posed by the client: how can we be more successful with small to medium-sized enterprises? And so we started talking to the proprietors of small to medium-sized enterprises around the world. And what we found is that they were only vaguely aware of COP. They were only vaguely aware of Davos. But more importantly, it didn't move them at all. Oh. And to cut to the end of the project, what we found is that small to medium-sized enterprises, and I'm extrapolating here to ordinary people who are getting on with their lives all over the world, are really more motivated by their place in their community rather than their place in the broader world. And so while it's very important that global policymakers turn up at these global events, that they discuss the urgency, they discuss new policy initiatives, and that there are broad agreements that devolve down into governments and the legislators, as Ruth was referring to. But it's also equally important, I think, for journalists to kind of find the community relevance of these ideas. Yeah, so for example, one of the things that we found very, very insightful about how a small to medium-sized enterprise would kind of react to a climate message from a global energy company was, how might this make me look in my local community? Will it make me look as though I'm a leader? Will it make me look as though I'm somebody who's pro-progress? Would it make me look as though, in certain circumstances, that I'm making a political choice? And so I think that, unfortunately, journalists kind of, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's hard. I think we have to kind of think about the journalistic community as being translators of top-down ideas from the likes of COP and Davos and other kind of global think tanks, but also kind of like translate the hopes and dreams and realities of real people on the ground, whether they be people who run small businesses or people who consume products and services from businesses, and think about the relevance of those ideas to the regular humans. And I don't think we can just necessarily accept that just because there is a big global event that just happens to be rich in information that helps drive our journalistic output, that the rank and file people in the world are either aware and or as interested and or would be motivated by just the facts and figures associated with that. I think we have to go the next stage, as I mentioned before, about translating those facts, that information, into something that kind of feels relevant to people in their daily lives. So that project surprised me, because I, like many people who read the newspaper every day or see the things online, I'm consuming information and worrying about, like, is this ever going to be solved? Is there a pathway to a solution? Are there ideas that might represent a solution? And I'm just making a terrible assumption as a marketer and as a brand thinker that everybody is as interested in the kind of the broader facts and figures as I am. And it's just not true. That I think it kind of goes to this idea of kind of awareness fatigue and a lack of trust, and honestly, just a lack of relevance and resonance for those facts and figures and how I might translate those into change of behavior in my daily life.
I think when you said that they weren't aware of Davos or COP, to me, and again, like, you know, why should people always be, just because we're in that space? And so I was like, wow. And I'm thinking, well, actually, yeah, I mean, it's not a coffee conversation, is it? It's not something you turn up and you chat to your mate about over a cup of tea or something. So Ruth, I saw you took your mute off. What was it?
Yeah, I'm super interested in this because it exactly comes to the other side of this idea of the way that we talk about culture. And actually, you know, sometimes it's that I spend more time reading, for example, the leisure section lifestyle and leisure than I really do reading the other side of it, because actually it's really comforting and it's entertaining. So, you know, when I think about the world of brands and the world of the small business, and you know, actually COP is not for them. COP is about changing legislation, and it does filter down. But you have that other side of it where you're talking about that kind of the pool of exciting brands and exciting stories. So, you know, you can change the narrative around sustainability by almost doing exactly the same content that happens at the moment, but that all of it has a sustainability lens. So it can be that every time you have a kind of top 10 product feature, you're featuring more sustainable products. And it can be that when you're doing editorials or features on people, those people are interesting founders of sustainable businesses, and creating that kind of aspiration and sense of luxury around that, and the kind of leisure content. So they're kind of like the white bread of of content and news, maybe, you know, it's easy to consume and really enjoyable too. But actually, if you start shifting norms and shifting expectation through that content, then you know, it's also coming at it from the other side of it, and you're probably going to reach different people with that as well.
And then Suzanne, that sort of dovetails perfectly into some of the things you were talking about the arts, and how you've been working in that space, sort of to change that narrative and that dialogue, and showing up in places where people, through an art lens, for instance, become way more interested in this. And I think that's a really good point, Ruth, about, you know, in the leisure sections, in the sort of the more features. If it becomes more normalized to put through those products, and then, you know, we just call it as like, it's just an expectation that, you know, adaptation and mitigation language becomes threaded through all of these, then it just becomes a habit. It's just a day-to-day way of living a new life. So yeah, Suzanne, do you want to just touch on a little bit of that?
Yeah, and I think there's a really rich tradition of, you know, cultural workers being part of the environment movement. You know, Ken Saro-Wiwa, for example, you know, as well as being an environmental activist, he wrote the equivalent of what was like EastEnders in Nigeria. It was like a radio play that, you know, really gave space, I think, for, you know, as well as like digesting information, you need time to sit with it, to sit with your uncertainty, you know, have more dialogue. You know, if you're a worker in the energy field, like, what, you know, what does this mean for losing your job? Like all of the stories. And often when people are working on climate works, I always tell them that's actually your bread and butter. That's your content, is the uncertainties, bringing people on the journey there. Don't already think you've got to hit them with the climate apocalypse. So I think really seeing culture as the space to like digest our emotions, our feelings, to reach people where they are. But then I'd also go on the flip side, that we have to be careful that we're not spoon feeding as well. We're in a new moment where it's been difficult to witness what we've witnessed for the last 600 days, but we have to be changed. We have to be moved. And the same with the climate crisis as well. So artwork and culture shift also is going to be an inner shift about toughening up, about coming into that reality. And that's where the culture space is important, to hold grief, to hold the ideas for new ways of living, for mutuality as well. And those in-person spaces, you know, even we were together at an event yesterday, and just being in the same room together to hold each other as well. So those things that can feel soft, or they're just like mushy, of the cultural space will be the containers for us to be able to process that data, to process that information. I think this COP is going to be, you know, the COP itself has acknowledged the role of culture for doing that. And because Indigenous communities will be front and center this year, hopefully that can get its due. So I would really urge us to sort of like expand the way that we view the possibilities, the function of culture, and how it's also one of the spaces where the most research can happen. There's nowhere as interdisciplinary or as, you know, willing to work between the disciplines as art as well. So really see the research component of culture as essential as well.
I loved what you just said about it's a container to process data and information, because I think that is true. I think if we even, you know, think back from COVID on, it's driven sort of isolation and, you know, sort of real fracturing of being able to even talk safely in spaces without being attacked, and really like understanding, you know, how we can create that dialogue. And I do think like we see like sort of even these conversations as really important ones to build those bridges between not only industries but people that are working in these spaces and the people that come interact with them, because by the dialogue and the intersection of the dialogue we can start to build a sort of more community aspect, because I think that's lacking as well in the world, right? Like you know, we've lost that sense of community and belonging. And we're all sort of hoping that these, you know, being able to even get into a real space again, you know, not being stuck in a remote place and working is really interesting. And Adrian, I just bounce over to you on that point, just in terms of the cultural sort of zeitgeist at the moment and the backdrop that we're seeing this all in, from a sort of a space of isolation and, you know, community. Do you see that in some of the work that you're looking at? There's a drive against that, and that we potentially as journalists could have a role in bringing people together in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. Not all journalists will align and agree that that is their role, but I think that there will be some in the journalistic community around the world who do see their role as being if not to align, to help people align, then to create the preconditions that people can come together and align behind ideas. I don't know if it's all that relevant to the topic or to the question you asked me, but one of the things that I saw recently was a speech that the eminent New York Times opinion writer and Atlantic contributor David Brooks made to the ARC conference, and I think it was only several months ago. In the middle of a very interesting speech, he made the point that culture changes when a small group of people find a more beautiful way of living, and that other people copy that more beautiful way of living. And I've seen that so often. What used to be a kind of like a highly desirable product to own in 1 year can quickly turn into a product no one wants in the next year. And when you look at the reasons for that, it's because it slipped out of the circle of aspiration and being kind of an artifact for beautiful living. There was a time in the kind of, I don't know, late aughts when everybody wanted a commercial kitchen, a stainless steel refrigerator and a chef, you know, like 6-burner oven. And then very, very quickly, but almost in a dark of night, a large number of people shifted to convection, you know, cooktops. And some of it might have been, you know, accelerated. Some of those choices might have been accelerated by legislation. But I feel as though journalism and the product of journalism can discuss the kind of the new progressive options that are available to people, and the reasons why they're desirable and the reasons why they're aspirational. People are looking to journalism partially because it is perceived as more objective than other sources of information, but also because I think journalists, some journalists, I would say, some journalism makes the future more feelable. it just it makes this kind of abstract idea of data points and information kind of feel, if you like, just a little bit more consumable, a little bit more feelable, a little bit more realizable for people. And I think that might be the pathway that journalism needs to take from a climate change point of view here. It's certainly as it relates to people coming together and agreeing that this is the way that they want to live. These are the choices they want to make. These are the aspirations. Some of that happens in small pockets, but I think it's fed with the journalism that kind of makes that ideal, that aspiration, a bit more feelable, a bit more realizable. And I'm sure that it won't be necessarily all journalists who feel like that's their role, but I think there'll be a subset of journalists who take on that difficult choice of like, how do we translate the data into something that kind of feels like it's an emerging aspiration for a beautiful way of living.
Yeah, and I love that. And there's a wonderful organization that we are hoping to collaborate with called Climate Spring, who work in the documentary and the TV film space. And how do we, their sort of mantra is like, they're changing how the world sees climate change. And so how do we start to build that thread between the journalists' research in the field and their, the content that they generate, and then making that into a beautiful piece of footage or film, which does so that it ends both, sort of works on both ends of the spectrum. And so yeah, I really love that. Maybe put that up as the mantra. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to just throw it to each of you. If you just wanted to leave everyone with like one nugget from today's conversation, just to think about, or you'd like to provoke thought on, or inspire people by, that would be just a wonderful way to end out. Ruth, I'm going to go over to you for that first question.
Oh my, what a responsibility. I think where I would probably like to end in thinking about the way that we talk about and act upon climate change is that I look at it with a sense of optimism. I think very often there's a hopelessness about it because it's such a big challenge and it travels through generations, and it seems like small actions wouldn't make a difference. But I think that, coming back to the idea of data, we're already seeing some green shoots of data that are showing that in some places we can travel in the right direction, and that by making small shifts, we can change the direction of the juggernaut. So I think what the role of journalism can have in this space is to balance the emergency with a sense of that optimism, and understand that in many, many small steps, we can travel a long distance. So I think that's my message, and it's about optimism.
I love that. Small steps, long distance. Thank you. Adrian?
I feel like whatever the innovation is, whatever the new products are that are created that are designed to engage people in a cultural conversation around climate, the real litmus test of this is if those products didn't exist, what hole would it leave in people's cultural practice rather than just simply their news consumption? Because I think that for journalism to be effective in providing people with the information and the ideas to be able to sort of like have a personal response to this crisis, then it needs to help people change their cultural practice, not just their news consumption.
Yeah,
I don't know exactly what those look like, but I think that I would have that like at the top of my laptop as I was kind of like talking to my colleagues about like how should we design these products. They need to have the ability to become behaviours, not just facts that are learned.
Yeah, exactly. So that everything becomes an opportunity for adaptation or mitigation versus another, I think, Suzanne, you mentioned another piece of content in the world for the sake of that. Thank you. Amazing. Suzanne?
Yeah, I think you know, the climate crisis is a paradigm shift. It's one of the largest cultural paradigm shifts we've ever lived through. So really zooming out and seeing where you stand in that moment in history and doing that philosophical work of decolonization. And so that means getting real with ourselves in terms of, you know, a very simple example. Why have we heard about the LA fires, but the Manitoba fires, zilch? Why are we not hearing about them? How does the white supremacy, the misogyny, the, you know, European centeredness means how we're reading the climate crisis? And then also coming into the fact that we're already past the point, we're in a climate changed world. So reckoning with what has been our humanitarian response for the last 600 days, and can we rise to the occasion of what is going to be needed from us? Because it's going to be more of the same. There's going to be more devastation, more of those needs to respond with that humanity and that empathy. So I would urge us to move into a balanced moment. And I think when you work with frontline communities, that's something that you have to hold, which is like a sustained grief, a sustained joy when you continue to work. And then the other thing would be bravery. And we've seen that too. It's a moment of courageousness, which can also inspire creativity. So when we're saying creativity, that we think of the cultural forms that we've got, but also the new cultural forms that we will need to birth in this moment to be able to communicate, to connect, and to survive as well. So that's also that decolonization of moment, the understanding our ancestors, our communities. We've already seen world's end, and we're holding the ancestral knowledge for this moment. So ensure that our communities are resourced to be able to think, to be able to respond, and also to take our place in this moment together.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I super appreciate this conversation, all the work you're all doing, and also the just the diverse thinking in this. It's really important to embrace that. So thank you so much. And here's to us moving mountains together for a more beautiful life. Thank you so much.